Welcome you all to Trek Wars. Alright, so today on Trek Wars, we're going to be talking about one of the most important ships in Klingon history that you probably don't know about. And that would be the F-5 Frigate, which is the Kuv class. Now, the Kuv class stardate first observed by the Federation is in 2330. The reason why this ship is so important, we'll discuss a little bit later. But let's get a little backstory to understand where the Kuv class has come from. So the F-5 Kuv class frigate is one of the oldest starship classes still in service in the Klingon Empire. Intelligence reports placed having entered service in 2217, about the same time as the D4 Dama class battlecruiser and the N5 Hartul class transport. Up until the introduction of the bird of prey in 2264, it was by far the most widely used, powerful enough to hold its own in Starfleet combat, yet affordable enough to be within reach of even the poorest of houses. The F-5 set a standard for Klingon frigates that in certain aspects still remain unmatched. The F-5 Kuv mounts an impressive firepower on a compact and rugged warp dynamic hull just large enough for customization and reconfigurations. Numerous variants of the basic F-5 abound, even more than those of the Derail series. Part of the reason is that for many years the F-5 was the mainstay of the various Klingon houses. In addition to standard Imperial fleets, variants such as Support, Jeep, Carrier, Penal Ship, and etc. exist. A number of these houses came up with their own custom configuration for the F-5s. In their possession, the F-5... So things to note about the F-5 is the F-5 was a very popular export craft. Many were purchased by the Empire's allies and vassal states for their own use. The ship was instrumental to the Klingon Empire from a budgetary standpoint as well as an offensive capability because of it being a relatively cheap starship with decent firepower. So this is one of the design aspects that makes this a very valuable design to the Klingon Empire, is that everyone can build it, it can be sold, and it's a relatively cheap starship that's pretty effective. Now, that's not its most important aspect to the Klingon Empire, but it's just something that's relatively important that we should all know and note, is that this ship is a mid-class starship in every realm. Its firepower is mid, its shielding is mid, its speed is mid, so it's nothing great, and it does fall behind other ships that are out there. So the Federation starships, their average frigate is much stronger than the F-5 frigate. So I just want you guys to know that and understand that. This ship is not an impressive ship. It's a ship that is built in mass. And there's also another ship, when they talk about all these different variants, before the F-5 frigate actually came into play, there was the F-4 frigate. So the F-4 frigate is identical, and it was originally a scout ship. So part of the reason why this ship is so small is that in actuality, the frame of the starship of the F-5 frigate is technically a scout ship. But because of its armament, they're going to call it a frigate. Now, ships of this time period are relatively small, so the size of this ship isn't that much of a liability during this time period. Later on, it would be, and this ship would be phased out. Alright, so let's kind of look at some of the stats of this ship. So it has 5 standard disruptors, 2 heavy disruptors. It's capable of warp 4, and it has a max of warp 7. Now its crew is 125, and its mass is 26,500, and its length is 92 meters. Now let's compare this to the ship that we would all know, which would be the D7. Now, the D7 of this time period has 10 standard disruptors, 2 heavy disruptors. It's warp 6 at its cruising speed, and it has warp 7 at its max. It has 452, has a mass of 110,000, and a length of 260 meters. So there's a significant difference between these two ships. So even a Federation Saladin class would be able to defeat an F-5 frigate. So the F-5 frigate is not comparable to newer Federation starships or modern Federation starships. And the reason for that is this is an old design. It's been around for a long time, and the Klingons have been using this to conquer other minor races. So the ship design has been around for a while, and it's replaced some of the other aging Klingon designs which we're familiar from like Enterprise. Now, when it comes to its role as a combat vessel, it was used as a combat frigate, and they would engage larger ships like a Constitution class, never on a one-on-one. They're going to hit them in groups, and they could do significant damage. Now, you can remember, this ship has 5 standard disruptors, which is a pretty reasonable amount of weapons, but what's really going to get you is the fact these ships are still heavy disruptors. So imagine a situation where the Constitution class is being attacked by 3 of these small ships, but they're being hit all with heavy disruptors, just like the D7. Alright, now if we were to calculate the shields, they would be around 214,500. Its whole value would be 71,550, and its total will be 286,050. So when it comes to shielding, this ship is under-shielded, and as you can see, its hull strength is relatively weak. So its total output during this time period is it's less than half the strength value of a D7, which is not surprising, but for a cheap, mass-produced frigate, these are pretty acceptable standards. So this small frigate has got teeth, 2 heavy disruptors and 5 standard disruptors, so that gives it an attack value of 148,750. Its shields are 214,500. Its hull value 71,550. Gives it a full defense of 286,050. So overall, this is a pretty effective starship for its price. The E4 Escort class, cousin to the famed F-5 Couve class frigate, entered service. The legendary F-5 Couve class frigate, perhaps the most infamous small capital ship ever fielded by the Empire, aside from the Bird of Prey, enters service. So what makes this ship so important to the Klingon Empire is simply the time period. It allowed the Klingon Empire to build an army much larger than it should have. And it didn't do this because the ship is just easy to construct and because of its cheap price point. It actually has to do with something more important than that, and that is the crew. So the Klingon Empire at this time had reconstructed its military differently than any other race during this time period. And they started using conscripts and slaves inside their starships. And this is what led to the unique design that the Klingon F-5 frigate has. So one of the really unique things about the Klingon Empire is their design of having this very large round structure in the front of the ship connecting through a pylon, which is very thin, leading to the back of the ship. And it connects to the engineering section. And this is a very strange design, and a lot of people have always pointed out and wondered why on earth would the Klingon Empire design ships like this? Because this is radically different than anything that we had seen before. So Klingon ships in the past, during Enterprise era, they don't really have this super small thin area. You know, they're relatively same. We know that this extended neck also is good for warp dynamics, but they didn't really have this giant ball in the front. You know, they're pretty similar in size. All these designs went obsolete. These designs were run by, the Klingon houses. Once the Empire got too large and they could no longer field their own ships with the houses, the numbers they had, because you remember the Klingon Empire is split between huge amounts of different houses, small, medium, and large, and so they don't have a full military running off the actual population. It's all based on the tribes, basically, of the Klingon Empire, the great houses. So the Klingons found a really easy way to bypass this problem. So the circular part of the ship would have whatever house owns the Klingon ship, their loyal members are located inside the round part of all Klingon ship designs. Now, that long neck is the only way to get from the bridge to the engineering section. And inside the engineering section, where most of the crew is, they are going to consist of conscripts, which are other houses that are working for that house, or their conquered houses or slaves. So because you're using obviously conscripts, other warriors from a different house, you have people you have conquered who are your enemies who are forced to work on your ship, the probability of them raising up against you is very likely. So, in order to compensate for this, the Klingon Empire decided, in my opinion, a fantastic design. Well, we're going to keep you in the back of the ship, and if you try to come and take over the ship, we're going to blow you away. So the way this works is that there is only one way to go from the bridge to the rear section, the engineering section. You have to go down this long corridor, and the Klingons that are aboard the ship that are loyal to the captain, they're always stationed, and there's always guards that are armed sitting in the tunnel. And if you try to come and take over the ship or mutiny, you're just going to get blasted. So the F-5 frigate is cheap, it's efficient, it's a decent starship, but most importantly, its radical design of using slaves to power the ship allowed for the Klingon Empire to raise its empire and its military strength exponentially higher than it should have been able to. The new and radical design from the F-5 frigate was brought into the D-5, the D-7, as well as the D-10, and the dreadnoughts of the Klingon Empire. It was one of the most successful designs that the Klingon Empire had ever constructed, and this led to the Klingon Empire being able to significantly increase the number and power of its forces by using constructs and obviously fallen or conquered houses. So the Klingon Empire overall, this design having this bizarre large round structure in the front of the ship, and then the neck is a design for this new doctrine. So this ship has pretty decent offensive capabilities, but its defenses are relatively low compared to other starships. So they're going to typically operate in squadrons of 3 or more. So these ships will use their older variants, which would be the F-4 frigates. If they will find a target, they'll relay that information, and then there will be a squad which will go and attempt to intercept an enemy starship. So for an example, because Federation frigates can defeat these guys typically on a one-on-one basis, they would typically overwhelm them with at least 3 starships. Now, another common thing that would be seen when they're trying to take on bigger, stronger targets is it wouldn't be uncommon for a squadron to be led by a D7 itself. So a squad would probably try to weed out and attack the smaller frigate, while the D7 would engage the larger target, and then the 3 remaining vessels would then help take out the remaining capital class starship. So these ships are more of a offensive rather than defensive. And I would say that because these ships can hit hard, but they can't take a beating. They're somewhat of a glass cannon. So it's real important that when we look at this ship, when we look at its stats, we see that its offensive capabilities are pretty good and its shielding is pretty good. It's a small ship. It can't really take much. Somewhat of a glass cannon. But there's something about else the ship we need to understand is that all of its subsystems are mediocre. Its sensors, its targeting system, its thrusters, everything is basically very old and obsolete at this point in time. This ship was built in mass, and it would eventually be replaced by the Bird of Prey as a scout ship. I mean, by the time that this ship entered the field and was fighting the Federation, it was very old, very outdated, and it was pretty easy for Federation ships to outmaneuver these ships. And if you got behind them, you could take them out. Their weapons were almost all forward facing, just like a lot of the Klingon ships at this time period. It was a mediocre ship. By the time that Starfleet and the Klingon Empire were at war, this ship was obsolete. So Federation conflicts like the 2267 really showed that the F-5 frigate wasn't capable of going toe-to-toe. It took significant losses during the Federation wars and border skirmishes. Eventually the F-5 frigates would just be relegated to, you know, non-urgent or non-important sectors and stations, border patrol and things of that nature, while the D7 took the role of the F-5 frigate as a cruiser and command ship. It was a relatively strong ship when it first came out. It gave the Klingon Empire the thrust and the ability to spread its wings, and without it, the Klingon Empire would have never been the Klingon Empire that we know. So it's not that this ship was not particularly great or anything of that nature. It's just it was used far beyond its time, and it suffered for it. Now, I'm curious what you guys think of the F-5 frigate. Do you think that it was a design that was a complete and utter game changer like I think, or do you have a different opinion about it? Do you think it was a bad idea to use slave labor to increase the numbers of your starships, to increase your military might by forced labor? Do you think it was a mistake on the Klingon Empire, or do you agree with this idea? And how do you feel about the explanation of the thin necks on Klingon ships? Thank you for watching Trek Wars. If you like this material, please subscribe and make a comment. And with that being said, victory is life.